Here in the UK, 3 former Supreme Court justices have joined more than 600 legal experts in calling for the government to end weapons sales to Israel. One of those former justices is Lord Sumption. Talking to the BBC, he explained why he decided to sign the letter.
I was sent a copy of it. I thought that it was a persuasive and moderately expressed letter, which makes some very important points that the UK government seems to be losing sight of. The most important point is that Article 1 of the Genocide Convention requires states to do what they can to prevent genocide. Now, it hasn't yet been determined whether what the Israelis are doing is genocide. The ICJ, International Court of Justice, is considering that issue. But they have already ruled that there is a plausible case that that is what is going on in Gaza. And it seems to me that if you have a duty, as we do, an international law to prevent genocide, and there is a plausible case that that is what is happening, you should do what you can to obstruct it.
Well, let's speak to our political correspondent, Hannah Miller, who's at Westminster. Hannah, what has the response from the UK Prime Minister and from the main opposition party leader been?
At the moment, we've not had any direct response to that letter from 600 prominent lawyers and academics, but there is clearly a kind of growing weight of voices behind this call for the UK to suspend arms sales. And there's a handful of Conservative MPs now saying that the deaths of UK aid workers must be a line in the sand. That's a quote from Paul Bristow, the Peterborough MP. As I say, one of just a handful, but adding to that, there's also the former Foreign Office Minister, Sir Alan Duncan, who has said that it can no longer be justified that we send arms over to Israel. And he previously had responsibility for looking at who gets export licences and where arms can go. I would say, though, that there are Conservative MPs who believe that the UK must stand by Israel, including the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who visited Israel this week, and also Lord Frost, the former Brexit negotiator. He said Israel must not just be allowed, it must be enabled to win this war. That's because it's in our national interest to do so, he said. So in that sense, there's not a kind of united, uniform view within the Conservative Party, but there is added weight behind those calls for the UK to suspend arms sales. Labour's position is to ask for the government to publish its legal advice on the issue. They say that if that legal advice shows that Israel hasn't been meeting its international obligations, then arms sales should be suspended. That is a more nuanced view than has been taken by the Liberal Democrats and the SNP, who have been calling for some time now for arms sales to be suspended.
Hannah, thank you. That's our political correspondent, Hannah Miller, at Westminster for us. Well, let's speak now to John Deverill, a former brigadier with the British Army and former Director of Defence Diplomacy at the Ministry of Defence. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we heard there that the deaths of the UK aid workers represented for some a line in the sand. What was the specific turning point for you where you believed that it was no longer OK for the UK to supply weapons to Israel?
Well, Lakshmi, thanks for having me on. So going back in time, I, for the best part of 2 years, was the senior British officer working in the Palestinian territories. And from that perspective, I got to know the Israeli Defence Forces very well. I was around at the time of a massive incursion by the IDF into Gaza, Operation Cast led. So I've seen this close up in the past. And for me, the turning point actually was a long time ago. And the calls about which people have been hearing on your programme for the last 5-10 minutes have come late in the day, because it was completely clear to me, looking at the scale of the casualties on the civilian side, that from a military point of view, as a former military operational planner and somebody who knows the IDF, adequate care, in my view, was not being taken by the IDF as of a long time ago in this campaign in order to minimise civilian casualties.
John, you were among signatories saying that the UK should stop sending arms to Israel before today and last week as well. A cross-party group of MPs said the UK should stop sending arms to Israel. And now we've heard hundreds of legal experts saying the same thing. But which authority ultimately makes a judgment on this and can enforce it?
Well, of course, there are a number of reasons which we've been hearing in the last 10 minutes as to why we should be stopping arms exports. At the end of the day, it's the British government decision, but it's obliged by our government is obliged both by our own laws and by international laws not to provide export licenses if there is a plausible risk that those weapons will be used in violation of international humanitarian law, otherwise known as law of armed conflict. As far as I understand it, Lord Cameron, about a month ago now, said that the lawyers in the Foreign Office were going to look at whether or not IHL was potentially being breached. And we still have to learn about the results. There was a leak not long ago suggesting that they had already opined that IHL was in danger of being breached. And the point being, therefore, that our government potentially is out of order legally. We have form in this regard. Going back to, I think, 2017, the British government found itself in court and lost the case and was ordered by the judge to cease weapons exports to Saudi Arabia because the Royal Saudi Air Force was using British munitions and aircraft to bomb over Yemen without taking due care and consideration about civilian casualties. So we've been there before. And I can foresee, Lakshmi, that we will be here again pretty soon if we don't stop exporting weapons.
And John, just briefly, finally, what would the consequences be then for the UK if that were found to be the case?
Well, I would say a lot of embarrassment. I would say that, as I say, that we'll be ordered by a judge potentially to stop exporting if we don't preempt that by stopping doing that before then, i.e. soonest. I think also what I would like to see from a military point of view, which we certainly would do ourselves, not only the better coordination that your respondents have been talking about, but also accountability. So in our system, we would expect the soldiers and their chain of command in terms of officers to be held to account. And that's not only if it's sins of commission, i.e., for instance, the possibility that direct targeting took place on purpose in order to hit the humanitarian convoy yesterday, but also sins of omission, i.e., lack of adequate care. So I would like to see proper accountability as well, and that's certainly what we would do. I set out a model process on paper for our government, which went to number 10, and also Chief of Defence Staff on our side after the Saudi example I gave you earlier, setting out exactly what we ourselves would do in the British military in order to ensure that we minimise civilian casualties. And those are the sorts of things that our own government should be ensuring that, in this case, the Israelis carry out, and indeed any other country to whom we might export weapons in order to avoid being in breach of law.
Brigadier John Deverill, thank you so much for your time.